Hi guys, so I'm here finally. Sorry it took me a while. There was a lot of downed trees and power lines on the way home. There's a pretty big storm. So I have your submitted questions here that we'll be going over, and I'll clarify information about the Constitution and early government for U.S. history in preparation for the regents. So typically in the regions, if you see any kind of discussion about the beginning of democracy during the colonial period. This is going to be in reference to the Mayflower Compact. It's this early representative democracy. They're going to be working together to make decisions, a vote on it. You'll also see with Virginia House of Burgesses, a representative organization, and New England town meetings where people can actually go, voice opinions, have discussions. These are all examples of early democracy taking place during the colonial period, during that time called salutary neglect, where Great Britain is really too focused on their own issues in the old world to really worry or deal with the day-to-day dealings of their colonies in America. And what we see from this is that the colonies kind of come up with a sense of independence. The colonies are kind of like teenagers, and Great Britain is their parents, and their parents kind of neglected them, ignored them, let them do their thing. And the colonies have taken care of themselves, made sure things ran smoothly. And then we see salutary neglect ends, the colonies start to tighten the screws a little bit. They're trying to be a parent once again, and problems start to arise. We always say no taxation without representation as kind of the start of the American Revolution. Their colonists are upset that Great Britain is now charging all these taxes. Great Britain's like, look, we helped you during the French Indian War. We protected you from the French and their Native American allies. The least you could do is pay our war expenses. And of course, the colonists who had this sense of democracy from these early beginnings didn't like that. They're like, we don't have representation in Parliament. Parliament is making all these tax laws. It's really not fair for the colonists to not have representation in Parliament, but have to pay these taxes. You want us to pay them, give us representation. Of course, that doesn't happen. There's also the quartering of soldiers. I always say, like, the TV show Turn, I really like, kind of gives you some insight into what it was like to be a colonist and have to house British soldiers in your home. Later on, when we're creating the Bill of Rights, the Third Amendment will ban quartering of soldiers. You also see that the British were searching colonist homes as things started to kind of become problematic. Again, they don't have any warrants, they're just going in. And this will be addressed with the Fourth Amendment when we create the Bill of Rights to prevent unlawful search and seizure of goods. Freedom of the press is also going to be questioned during the colonial era. We see this with the Peter Zenger trial, where Peter Zenger printed an article that was true but negative and was arrested. And of course, they're saying you can't speak out against the king or any of his magistrates. And again, the colonists will address this when they ultimately gain independence and then create the First Amendment to protect freedom of the press, freedom of the speech, etc. So obviously, there's issues. The colonists were angry about Great Britain increasing controls on them after having this long period of kind of like freedom to do their day-to-day thing that we saw with the Mayflower Compact, Virginia House of Burgesses, New England town meetings. And then we see, the Revolutionary War essentially gets started. The Declaration of Independence is going to be written, and that's not just a statement to Great Britain saying we declare independence from you, but this is a statement to the world that the United States is now a separate nation. They pull from Enlightenment ideas such as John Locke's natural rights, right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, this idea that if the government is not protecting these natural rights, we can overthrow it and replace it. They list all these grievances, like 27 things that Great Britain's doing wrong, and the big ones are, taxation without representation, the fact that their civil liberties are being violated, that, we have a right to rebel, that Great Britain's not protecting our natural rights, so we can revolt against them. And, the big thing on the regions, if they mention Declaration of Independence, they're going to talk about natural rights, they're going to talk about John Locke. And you should automatically think life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Sometimes instead of pursuit of happiness, it says property. Let me just make sure I'm not missing any of your questions. Okay. Then we see we have independence, yay, from Great Britain. And now what do? And so they have to, our founding fathers have to figure out how to run the government. And they're concerned if they have a really strong and powerful ruler again, they'll have the similar experiences that they had as a colony, where you end up with this tyrant or dictator. So the Articles of Confederation is created as our first government, our first plan of government. It creates a very weak national government. It's a very loose association of states. The federal government doesn't have any real power. They can't collect taxes. There's only one branch, the legislative branch, but they can't really get anything done because even if they wanted to amend the Articles of Confederation, all 13 states would have to agree. I can't even get my husband to agree with me on what candy to get at the movies. So you're definitely not getting 13 different states with different needs and wants to all agree together. And it basically is really ineffective. Some of the major weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation that might pop up on the regions would be they have no power to coin money. Each state had their own money. I hate going to New Jersey. Could you imagine if you had to exchange money every time you went to New Jersey, how awful that would be? This is why you saw the European Union ultimately switch over, for the most part, to the euro. It's easier. But the federal government had no power to do that. They also had no power to tax. They had to ask the states for money, which pretty much went over how it went over when I asked my parents for money in high school, which was like a chuckle and go get a job. The states were not giving money to the federal government. Other issues is they couldn't really raise an army, so they're pretty weak, and they couldn't actually defend the nation against anything. Only strengths that you might see on the regions in regards to the Articles of Confederation would be the Land Ordinance and Northwest Ordinance. So these both have to do with land and how we organize territory. So Land Ordinance is just basically how do we survey land, how do we divide it up. Northwest Ordinance, how does this land become a territory and then ultimately a state. I mean, you don't necessarily have to remember the finite little details there, but you definitely should know that this has to do with, how does land ultimately become a state? Only real victory there. Ultimately, Articles of Confederation is, weak. The federal government can't do anything. And so we have to hold a constitutional convention. This isn't a convention like those Comic-Cons I like to go to with a bunch of nerds. They're nerds, but they're really smart nerds. They sat down, all these founding fathers, and they decided to hash out a new plan for our system of government, and that's the Constitutional Convention. And there's a lot of compromise. This is back when our government actually could sit down and get things done, I guess. So the Constitutional Convention is often called a bundle of compromises because they had to make deals. And a lot of these deals had to do with representation and slavery. So the Great Compromise is the big one. You need to know it. It's great. The Great Compromise. So you have a New Jersey plan and a Virginia plan, and they combine to become the Great Compromise. And this basically is a way to make little states and big states happy about representation. We create a bicameral legislature. That means bi is two. So you have two houses. So this is Congress. We're creating Congress out of the Great Compromise. We have the House of Representatives, which makes all the big states super happy because everyone is going to be able to have a census taken every 10 years, see how much your population has grown or shrunk, and then we'll give you the number of representatives based on your population. So House of Representatives is based on population, which makes big states happy because you have a big population, you get more representatives. And then to make the little states happy, we have the Senate. Everyone's equal. Everyone gets 2 senators. And again, a compromise. The other compromise is the 3/5 compromise, and each slave in the South will count as 3/5 of a person for representation and taxation. The South had a pretty large population of slaves, so they want them to count in their population so that they can get more representatives in Congress. But the North was like, hold up a second, you consider them property. Of course, the North had slaves too, but not as in large numbers. Like, if they're property, why should we let you count them as your population so you have more power in Congress? Because this is all about keeping a balance of power between the North and the South. Ultimately, 3/5 compromise. Each slave will count as 3/5 of a person. And then, of course, we also need to create a system that'll help us elect the president. During this time period, people were concerned that if we had like one man, one vote, that people could be swayed or they could be confused. So we developed this electoral college process, which is essentially the senators and House of Representatives, which are the ones who ultimately elect the president based on how each state voted. You can get more information in class on that, or there's a really good video that explains the Electoral College much better than I do, which I can always share with you if you want to just ask me. We also see that there is, a policy created in the Constitutional Convention to allow the Constitution to change over time, and this is the amendment process. Because of the Articles of Confederation, it was nearly impossible to create an amendment to change it, which is why we just kind of wiped it out and had a brand new Constitution created. So we want to make sure that the Constitution could change as needed to reflect the times. And I'm going to get more into that in a little bit. But there's a problem. Not everyone agreed with the Constitution. And this is where we get this big debate between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. So Federalists think federal government, they want a strong federal government. These are people like Alexander Hamilton. Like, the federal government under the Articles of Confederation was weak. They didn't do anything. We need a strong federal government. And then there's people like Thomas Jefferson, people who are anti-federalists, Madison. I'm sorry, not Madison. Henry Clay. A number of people. Nope, not Henry Clay. I am way off my game tonight. They are anti-federalists. They are against a strong federal government. They want the states to have more power, and they are concerned that if the Constitution doesn't explicitly lay out our rights as citizens, the federal government can violate them. And what we see are the Federalists, people like Madison and Hamilton, write all of these papers called the Federalist Papers that are pro-Constitution and trying to get people to support it. Their big argument saying, hey, this is fine. It doesn't tell the government they can take your rights away. So they can't. If it doesn't tell them they can do it, they can't do it. And the anti-federalists are like, no, nah, we want a Bill of Rights. We want it spelled out, freedom of speech. You can't quarter soldiers. We want the right to bear arms. We want protections, against search and seizure. We want rights spelled out, or else we are not going to ratify or, support this Constitution. Ultimately, the Bill of Rights is added. It's our first 10 amendments, and the Constitution becomes the official outline for our government. So this is where we get into those three branches of government and how they get set up. And I know some of you were asking tips to try to remember these guys and everything. So there's three branches. You have the legislative branch. Legislative, they make laws. That's Congress. And then you have executive. So the executive branch is the president, the vice president. They're elected through the Electoral College. And then you have the judicial branch, which is the judicial Supreme Court, judicial review, right? So legislative branch makes laws. They can also override presidential vetoes as a form of checks and balances. They have to approve anyone appointed to a position. They have to approve treaties negotiated by the president. They're the ones who outline the taxes. They regulate interstate trade between the states. They're the ones who declare war. And if there's a question of whether or not the president has been unable to carry out their duties, or maybe they violated the law, Congress are the ones who could bring up charges of impeachment and ultimately oversee the trial. The executive branch, president, vice president, their cabinet, they enforce the laws. They can veto laws passed by Congress. They appoint ambassadors, diplomats, judges, cabinet members. All that is appointed by the president. And the president can negotiate treaties. So think about Thomas Jefferson. And he was able to purchase the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon because he organized it as a treaty, which was then ratified by Congress. The president can also grant pardons. So just this past week, we were talking about Ford and how he pardoned Nixon. And we see that President Washington, our first president, sets up this kind of practice of only having 2 terms. That was just kind of like a general policy guidelines. And then FDR had to go and ruin it for everyone and he get 4 terms. And then Congress will pass the 22nd Amendment to make it official that you can only have 2 terms. As far as the judicial branch, this is the courts, the Supreme Court. They interpret the laws. They have the power of judicial review. So judicial branch reviews laws, judicial review. They determine if laws are constitutional or unconstitutional, and this was established by the Supreme Court, Marbury versus Madison. The Supreme Court came to settle disputes between states, between the state and federal government, states and foreign countries, or even individuals and the federal government. Keep in mind that we do have a systems of checks and balances trying to ensure that no one branch is more powerful than the other. And this, like I've said, Congress can override presidential vetoes. The president can override or veto a law passed by Congress. The judicial branch has the power of judicial review, so they can review laws or executive orders to make sure that they are constitutional. But these are all ways that they can make sure that, they're balanced out. Someone asked, how much power does the president really have? And, keep in mind, a while ago we did a essay talking about are these presidents like Jefferson with his Louisiana Purchase or Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation? Are they acting within their power or are they expanding their power? And we do see that presidents increase power during kind of like crises or kind of extraordinary times. So usually time of war, presidents might have their power increase. But again, we always have these checks and balances to fall back on and regulate to make sure that things carried out by the president are within, the Constitution. But keep in mind, the way courts have interpreted the Constitution have changed over time. I mean, Plessy versus Ferguson, this wasn't with the president, but the Supreme Court said separate but equal is okay. And then in the 1950s, you get Brown versus Board of Ed, and the Supreme Court goes, you know what? That's not okay. Supreme Court in Korematsu versus the United States upholds Japanese internment. And for many of us, we might be like, wow, that's, violating their rights. But over time, the way we interpret the Constitution and, the way we view different groups in America do change. And that's part of the course and understand these changes taking place, how we can modify the Constitution through the amendment process or in via judicial review. Okay. Flexibility. So that kind of brings us back, judicial review, the flexibility of the Constitution. It needed to be able to change because times change. So we have judicial review. You can interpret those laws. Like I said, Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equals okay. Brown versus Board of Ed, not okay. So we get a change because of the judicial review process. We also see the elastic clause. And again, if I go back to earlier essays in the year, a lot of people got confused when they talked about Thomas Jefferson and Louisiana Purchase. They talked about this from this idea of the elastic clause. That's not the case. The elastic clause only applies to laws carried out by Congress. So elastic clause is also called implied powers or the necessary and proper clause. And essentially this says that Congress can make all laws necessary and proper for carrying out like their duties or protecting the United States. And the implied powers is this idea that anything not explicitly stated in the Constitution is a power of the state is implied. It belongs to the federal government. It belongs to Congress who makes laws. People, I think, were confused with this idea of Thomas Jefferson using a treaty to buy Louisiana. That has nothing to do with the elastic clause. It does have to do with how the Constitution is interpreted over time. So if we go back and we talk about Federalists and Anti-Federalists, you also get these ideas of loose and strict interpretation of the Constitution. So loose interpretation of the Constitution is this idea that the Constitution's flexible. If it doesn't tell you you can't do it, then you probably can. And then a strict interpretation of the Constitution is more of like the anti-federalist, this idea if it doesn't tell you in the Constitution that you can do it, as the president or as Congress or as the Supreme Court, then you can't do it. And Thomas Jefferson was a anti-federalist and a strict constitutionalist. And he was like, if it doesn't tell you you can do it, we can't do it. And unfortunately for him, he had this moral dilemma because purchase in Louisiana was so vital for American expansion that ultimately he had to break with that and kind of go against his, core values and then purchase it via a treaty, thereby kind of following this loose interpretation of the Constitution. Let me double check to make sure I got elastic clause. One of the questions is a little confusing, but I think, it's asking about, why is the Constitution only really focused on America? So, different countries have different types of constitutions. So when we talk about the Constitution in our course, we're talking about the American Constitution. And this basically outlines the powers of our government and the structure of our government. It does regulate and kind of lay out groundwork for negotiating treaties with other countries, and then the fact that Congress would have to approve those treaties. But when we talk about the Constitution, we're talking about the United States Constitution. Okay. Okay, federalism. This is something that people mess up all the time. And again, I'm like, I don't have any tricks to help you remember, but federalism is a separation of powers between the state and federal government. So federalism, and is this belief we share powers. So you have powers that are delegated or given only to the federal government. This is things like having an army. Like we don't have the New York State Army. Concurrent powers, these are powers shared between the state and federal governments, things like taxes. We pay taxes to the state, we pay taxes to the federal government, we pay taxes to local governments. Pretty sure I pay taxes to my kid, but that's a concurrent or shared power. Reserved powers are powers reserved for the state. So for example, I'm a teacher in New York State, I'm licensed in New York State. That is established by New York State. If I want to go to Connecticut or New Jersey, I would have to be licensed in their state because that is a power reserved for the state. States are also supposed to have control over education and marriage. And this has come under fire recently because we've seen over the years as the federal government has become more involved and increased their power, they've also made laws guiding education as well as federal marriage protections. Implied powers are anything not given to the states is implied belongs to the federal government. And then denied powers, I will never be a princess or a duchess because you cannot give titles of nobility. It's denied, and you can't suspend habeas corpus unless you're Abraham Lincoln. But that's for another lesson. So again, for federalism, don't have a fancy little trick, but just remember federalism is shared powers or separation of powers, but you see the state and federal governments are both sharing powers. And let me double check. The Bill of Rights, the big ones to know would be the First Amendment, freedom of the press, religion, speech. Occasionally the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms will come up. Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, Sixth Amendment, and Seventh Amendment all have to do with protections for people. Protections against unlawful search and seizure, unlawful detainment, like you have a right to have a trial, and a protections against unfair penalties like fees and fines or punishments. Those are all protections for people. And then the 10th Amendment is any power not given to the federal government is reserved for the states. Again, this is this idea of, federalism, sharing those powers, separating some of those powers out to kind of make sure that the states still have some control. And then the unwritten Constitution. So that's actually one of the questions that Lila gave me. So when you think unwritten Constitution, think it's unwritten. It's not written down in the Constitution. It's a general practice or like tradition. So the first one would be like the two-term presidency. Nowhere in the Constitution did it say initially you only get 2 terms, but George Washington was like, I'm doing 2 and peace out. And for years, people followed that practice, that tradition, that precedent that he set until the 22nd Amendment was passed to make it official. Other elements of the unwritten Constitution would be the president's cabinet, his advisors. No place in the Constitution does it say the president is going to have this many advisors or an advisor, but George Washington, in his infinite wisdom, set the precedent and was like, you know what? I need a bunch of advisors. I'm pretty smart, but I don't know everything. So he creates a cabinet. And today we've seen over the years, we've added more positions to those cabinets as the need arise. Other aspects of the unwritten Constitution, political parties. There's no political parties mentioned in the Constitution, but they exist. Congressional committees, also not outlined in the Constitution, but they're like, committees sound great. Break things up, work in small groups, get things done. And then, of course, judicial review is one of these things that wasn't explicitly placed in the Constitution, but Chief Justice Marshall, when he was reviewing the case, Marbury versus Madison, was like, well, it's implied that we interpret laws. So therefore, judicial review. You know, the words judicial review are not actually in the Constitution, but if the Supreme Court's job is to review laws and interpret them, then it makes sense that they have the power of judicial review, which was established by the Supreme Court case Marbury versus Madison. Okay, so I'm going to double check to make sure that no one has submitted any last minute questions, either via Twitter or through our Google form, just because I don't want to miss anything. Okay, where am I? There's so much. Here we go. Mentions. Let's see. Is anyone sending me information on Twitter? Ooh, yes. The critical period. So the critical period just refers to this time at the end of the American Revolutionary War, where we are now creating a new government under the Articles of Confederation. And it's a critical period because this is like going to make or break us. Like either we're going to be like, hey, world, we told you we could do it. And look, we can. Or what do we get ourselves into? We are way over our heads and this is not working out. So that was very important. As far as declaratory act, this is just, if you see anything in the early parts of the regions during the colonial period that mentions acts, declaratory act, stamp act, tea act, these are just laws that Great Britain had passed to increase taxes or kind of tighten the screws and limit the civil liberties of colonists. See if there's anything else. Okay, not anything on Twitter. And let's see, last check for responses, questions online. I think that's it. So with that being said, my 2 wonderful viewers, there was 3, I'm going to be posting this, and the next one, I believe, is next week, and we might combine a couple of different topics. So you guys can let me know if there's anything in particular you would like me to do a review on.